Hello! Today I'm continuing my recent trend of discussing Final Fantasy villains with a look at the character of Kuja from Final Fantasy IX. And to be quite honest, in my original review of Final Fantasy IX, I didn't consider Kuja too thoroughly and was more concerned with the uniqueness of the game in terms of its ensemble cast, Shakespearean allusions and art direction, and also the existential identity themes that play out among the main party and particularly with Vivi. However, having returned to the game quite a few times since, it's really interesting to consider Kuja because not only does the identity theme play out strongly with him to the extent that we could consider him a parallel of Vivi that's simply kind of gone off in the other direction, but also he's one of the few and perhaps the only Final Fantasy antagonist I can think of right now that has a genuine change of heart and realises the error of their ways by the end of the game. So, before delving into Kuja, I'd like to note that I have conducted some Final Fantasy IX character analysis already, and they are available on the channel, but to be quite honest, the quality of those recordings is awful, because they're from quite a few years ago. And if you're interested to listen to them, they're available in the full Final Fantasy IX game discourse that I did, which I've re-uploaded with a much better audio quality. And what I'll do is I'll timestamp the description of that video with each character that I've discussed. So that's probably the place to go to listen to that. And on that note, I do intend to re-record and make more detailed character-specific episodes in future. It's just a matter of working back through all the Final Fantasy and non-Final Fantasy discourses that I've been sat on for a while now. So let's take a look at Kuja. First and foremost, narrative-wise, this guy is introduced in very good fashion as the man behind the curtain pulling the strings of Queen Brane. And the stages of his character development and the gradual story reveal is actually really good, because what we discover is that the man behind the curtain, Kuja, has a man behind that curtain attempting to pull his strings, which is Garland. So it's very layered and complex in nature as the game goes on. And it throws open this kind of reveal with regards to Kuja, which is that rather than this surface level narcissistic confidence, Kuja is actually really angst-ridden and on the cusp of an existential meltdown a lot of the time, which prompts his entire introduction and gradual ruthlessness as an antagonist, which I'll discuss shortly. So, I mentioned in my Final Fantasy IX review that 9 plays out as if it's on a stage, with some Shakespearean context and melodrama undulating beneath the aesthetics. And Kuja exhibits facets of this medieval theatrical style too, chiefly through dialogue and his descriptions of things. A good example of this is that he uses metaphor, and often actually theatrical metaphor. For example, he says things to Garnet like, "The curtain rises, my canary." And frankly, dialogue like this is not a million miles away from some Shakespeare lines, such as, "What light through yonder window breaks? It is east, and Juliet is the sun." But where Romeo is using the metaphor of the sun to indicate Juliet as the beacon around which he orbits, she's literally the light of his life, Kuja describes Garnet as the canary, which he elaborates on throughout as her being something beautiful that's trapped in a cage like a bird. So both these characters, Romeo and Kuja respectively, describe these events through metaphor and wordplay. The first being a sunrise and the other being the curtain rising on a play. So, yeah, I think Kuja sits comfortably within this Shakespearean sort of dialogue and framework, which is really quite interesting. And also, Shakespeare famously wrote in iambic pentameter, which Kuja speaks in intermittently during his more poetic dialogues throughout the game, which is pretty cool as well. So, moving on, Kuja's raison d'etre is really quite complex and evolving throughout the game when we consider his purpose and his creation, and his subsequent realisation, because he goes on this pursuit of free will and rebels against Garland. And much like the black mages that he creates as weapons, Kuja himself is created for a defined and destructive purpose on behalf of Garland, which is really interesting and much like the prototypical Vivi, who developed consciousness, free will, and inquisitive thinking, so too was Kuja created with a certain sentience. He was basically created with a soul that permitted him to consider his place in the world and ponder the purpose of his existence beyond that of the common genome. So, where Vivi struggles, but eventually reconciles himself with the concept of death, the finiteness of being, and he resolves to approach life with an almost Kantian sense of moral duty, which is to say, regardless of the knowledge of death and the finiteness of his being, and the inherent meaninglessness of life, if you look at it in a broad sense, he subscribes to the idea of a moral law, and he believes that moral goodness itself is a reason to live life well. Kuja, however, goes off in the other direction, and the prospect of death drives him towards a selfish and almost sociopathic sort of nihilism that sees him attempt to bring the world crashing down, with him. If he can't live, then neither can anybody else. And the reason for this, which admittedly is explained better in the Ultimania than in-game, is that Garland ushered Kuja pre-made and pre-aware into the world, skipping the essential life lessons and cognitive development that is commonly had throughout childhood, which in the real world, psychologists such as Lawrence Kohlberg identifies as the 6 stages of moral development. So, missing these essential stages, which hinge around certain life experiences such as reward and punishment for certain actions, Kuja has the infantile ruthlessness and lack of moral compass, which, much like a child thoughtlessly pulling the wings off flies, it sees him oblivious to the suffering of others, and actually, thanks to Garland, it is indeed the purpose of his creation. So, in my original Final Fantasy IX game discourse, I mentioned that Kuja rebelling against Garland was much like Satan rebelling against God, which is also something I mentioned and is much more analogous to the story arc of Ardyn and also Ifrit in Final Fantasy XV. And I have since revised my idea of Kuja's fall, which is something I see as more philosophical than biblical in the context of this game. As I mentioned when discussing the main party, and particularly Vivi, Final Fantasy IX hinges around very ontological and existential themes about identity, what it is to be, and how to cope as a thinking, rational being with the knowledge of death. Looking at Kuja through the lens of existentialism, he seems to literally and figuratively embody Friedrich Nietzsche's famous proclamation that God is dead. And what I mean by this is not that Kuja literally kills his creator god Garland, which incidentally he does, but more along existential lines, God is dead because faith in him has become increasingly redundant in the wake of increased knowledge, self-realization, and independent thought and aspirations. As Nietzsche noted on mankind's philosophical and scientific advances throughout the 19th century, so too does Kuja, through freedom of thought, come to question his master. And rather than aligning himself with the empty automatons who make up the majority of the genome population, Kuja, having a soul and ambition and strength of will, rejects his master and seeks to forge his own way through life, briefly wishing to become the master of terror. So, in a sense, he wishes to become his own god and master, before discovering, very quickly that he has this finite lifespan and going crazy. So, Kuja's renewed independence and pursuit of individualism is conveyed through his very, shall we say, flamboyant dress sense and theatrical persona. He seems to force this independence from his genome origins on the world around him, and most importantly, through the guise of this uniqueness, he has concealed or castrated his tail, which is a defining racial feature that we see in Zidane and the other genomes. And on that note, I'm not sure whether he conceals it or has removed it, but in his transform, he does have a tail. So I'm assuming it's lingering there somewhere. So, edging towards Kuja's endgame, his juvenile naive, and generally stunted mental nature is gradually revealed. Much like Ultimisia in Final Fantasy VIII, Kuja exhibits a profound fear of death after Garland reveals his finiteness to him, and this is a driving factor behind his unravelling. Where Ultimisia strove towards time compression as a means of preserving her life indefinitely, however, Kuja takes a leaf out of Kefka's book and opts to nihilistically bring the world, and particularly his rival and superior Zidane, crashing down into destruction alongside him. So, considering this, I like Kuja for the same reason that I like Ultimisia, which is that they both operate in response to a deep-seated fear, rather than some arbitrary craziness. But the great conclusion for Kuja's story arc is that he does finally see the error of his ways. Going back to the 6 stages of moral development, we could say that throughout the events of the game, he does perhaps undergo or witness some of the transactions that contribute to moral development. But most poetically, we see him in the final moments of the game, where it's just him and Zidane, that he only comes to value life once he's defeated and on the very cusp of death. So there's some very romantic irony at play here that, once again, we could see befitting of a Shakespeare play. So that's my top-level look at Kuja and his relevance and function within Final Fantasy IX, and how he fits this mould of thematic identity and existential dilemma, which is a very permeable quality to the game, I think. And I really like how he and Vivi share so many characteristics, but in so many other ways are, diametrically opposed and divided in how they deal with this revelation. And this doppelganger duality and strangeness of Nine, which toys with this man as machine idea, is really quite interesting to consider, and it relates, in part, I suppose we could say, similar to Descartes' philosophy on animals and whether they can think or not. I find that quite a permeable thing when we look at the genomes and the black mages respectively. So broadly speaking, I think Kuja is perhaps a little overlooked when we have antagonistic personalities such as Kefka, Sephiroth and Jecht to contend with. But really, recalling particularly the mid to late game events in Final Fantasy IX, when he does have this character arc, and he comes out of the shadows a bit more after the Burmecia boss fight, I think he has a great amount of development, and he has a lot to offer, through this anger and this insecurity, and of course this eventual change of heart, which is so rare to witness, in a Final Fantasy villain.